Jesus was an Aramaic-speaking Jew of the Middle East, and the Assyrians are Aramaic-speaking Christians in the Middle East who have endured persecution for over 1,000 years. Join Voice of the Word Aramaic Bible teacher, artist, and author Stephen Missick as he examines the Bible through the ancient languages, peoples, lands, cultures, and times in which it was first revealed. Research the Scriptures, rescue persecuted Christians, and restore the Church to its Semitic roots. And now, Voice of the Word.
Hello, I'm Stephen Andrew Missick, and welcome to this episode of the Aramaic School of the Bible. This is episode number 5, where I'm going to discuss Christian origins in the East. The gospel began in what we call today the Middle East. Jesus began preaching in Galilee, and he went to Jerusalem, where he was crucified, died, and rose again. If you look at the book of Acts, it mostly focused on Paul and how Paul is taking the gospel from Jerusalem to Samaria. Well, he doesn't really go to Samaria. Philip, Peter, and John do. That's the account in the Gospel of John. But he goes to Asia Minor and to Greece, and finally, in the end of the book of Acts, Paul ends up in Rome. So the focus of the book of Acts is on the journey of the Christian message, the gospel, from the Middle East to Rome. But there are passages that speak of the churches in the East. Now, first off, where was Paul converted? He had his Damascus Road experience in Damascus. And what was Paul going to Damascus for? To arrest early believers, Jewish Christians, in Damascus. So there was already a community of believers in Jesus, the Messiah, in Damascus before Paul was converted. So I think that's very significant that the gospel had already spread out to Damascus. If you read the Bible carefully, after Paul was converted, he immediately took the gospel to Arabia, where his efforts were opposed by King Aretas of Nabatea. Those scriptures are Galatians chapter 1, verse 17, and 2 Corinthians 11, 32 through 33. One thing interesting about Paul, I read this book about missional theology, and it was talking about some details about Paul, which is very interesting. Paul was probably always trying to teach Gentiles about how to believe in the one true God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jesus was condemning the Pharisees and said, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, you'll go into the farthest country and convert a pagan, but then you'll make him twice the son of hell as you are." So Paul was probably one of those persons, a Pharisee, who was trying to evangelize the Greeks and Romans before he came to faith in Jesus. As a Pharisee, he was opposed to the early believers and he tried to destroy them. But on the Damascus Road, the road to Damascus, he had this experience. But the interesting thing is, the first thing Paul does, according to Galatians 1:17, is he goes to Arabia, apparently to preach the gospel to the Arabians. And we also see this in 2 Corinthians 11, 32 through 33, where he says that it was the king of Nabatea that pursued him. That's why he was led over the wall in the basket. And I've been to Damascus, and I've been to a street called Straight. I've been to the chapel where that marks the place where Paul was led over the wall in the basket. I've actually been into the house of Ananias, where Paul was converted. It's very fascinating how this is preserved to this day. But one of the early centers of Christianity is Damascus. That's just a fact. But I think it's interesting that Paul takes the gospel to Petra. Now, if you go to Jordan today, the big tourist attraction is Petra. It's called the Rose Red City, half as old as time. And a certain Arabian tribe called the Nabateans carved a city out of solid stone. It's really amazing. If you've seen the Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade movie, they used the building, one of the temple structures from Petra. They had it as the Temple of the Grail, but really that was Petra, the Geniza, the treasure house is what they call it. So Paul went there. Paul went to the Nabatean Arabs to preach to them about Jesus. And the king Aretas tried to kill Paul, and Paul had to flee for his life. So it was only later, after Antioch, after Paul began persecuting Christians, after Stephen was martyred, Greek-speaking Jews like Stephen were forced to flee. Some went to Alexandria, some went to Cyprus, some went to Antioch. And initially they would just preach to their fellow Jews, but at Antioch something happened. They preached to the Gentiles directly, and Gentiles believe, and this is where believers were first called Christians. This is in Acts 11:26. And when the apostles heard about it, they sent Barnabas. Barnabas, like Paul, was a bilingual Jew. He was from Cyprus, and so he grew up speaking Aramaic, Jesus' language, and Greek. So Joseph Barnabas went to Antioch to see what's going on. He was excited to see many Gentiles coming to believe in the Jewish Messiah. So he looked for, he went to Tarsus, found Paul, and that's when Paul's ministry really began. And I really admire the Apostle Paul, and he did a lot to change the world with the gospel message. So we know from the writings of Josephus, well, first off, before I go to that point, Antioch's very important, but Paul's ministering, most of his churches he founded were in the Middle East. Turkey is where the 7 churches of Asia were, but a lot of places where Paul ministered are in Turkey. Of course, now Turkey is only 1% Christian, but this is where Paul did a bulk of his ministry. Of course, Paul also went to Philippi, Thessalonica, and Corinth, and those are cities which still have Christian communities to this day. But many other places where Paul and the apostles ministered, like Ephesus, there's very few Christians because of the oppressions of the Muslims. But Paul, like Jesus, he visited Tyre and Lebanon, according to Acts 21, verse 3. We know from the writings of Josephus that the Jews spoke the same Aramaic language as the people of Mesopotamia. Josephus states in the first verse of his book, The Jewish War, and he mentions this, there was a large Jewish community in Mesopotamia as well, and Josephus claimed that he originally wrote his histories in Aramaic because it was his native language, and so that the people of the East could read his 2 monumental books, The War of the Jews and The Antiquity of the Jews. There was an Assyrian queen named Queen Helena of Adiabene. She converted to Judaism, and she's buried in Jerusalem. They found her tomb. So what's happening is the Jews still, they speak the same language. At the time of the 1st century, the Jews spoke the same language as the people of Mesopotamia. And there's a large Jewish community in Mesopotamia. And therefore, the fact of the matter is we know that that Assyrians and pagans were being attracted to the worship of the one God of the Scriptures. So we see that with Queen Helena, a pagan woman who's converted to Judaism. So this shows that Mesopotamia was a fertile mission field for the apostles. It should also be noted that on the day of Pentecost, many people from Mesopotamia were present and heard the gospel being proclaimed in their own languages. Acts chapter 2, verses 7 through 11, it says, "Aren't all these who are speaking Galileans? How is it that each of us hears them in our native language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites." Parthia are Iranians today. Medes are Kurds. Elamites, I think Elamite is in southern Iraq. It could be in southern Iran. I have to check the map. Of course, this is before they had these modern borders anyway. Residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, and parts of Libya near Cyrene. Notice I mentioned Judea. We're going to go back to that in a moment. Visitors from Rome, next verse, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism, Cretans and Arabs, we hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongues. I think it's significant that here you see Persians, which are Iranians, Kurds, and Arabs at the day of Pentecost. And the gospel is being proclaimed to these people. And now we have it in our mind that basically that God doesn't love the Arab people because they're supposedly descendants of Ishmael. I don't believe most Arabs are descendants of Ishmael. If you read in the book of Genesis, they were Arab people before Abraham was born. And Arab didn't have 2 sons, he had 8 sons. And of course the Jews and the Edomites descended from Isaac. And then Ishmael is an Arabian tribe, so were the other Joktan, Medan, I forget the names of the other 6 sons of Abraham through Keturah. So we shouldn't think, I think that this idea about Abraham and Ishmael really creates a barrier in dealing with the Muslim world, the Arab world. And we see here, of course, Islam was a religion that came into existence 600 years after the time of Jesus. And God loves Arab people. There are millions of Arab Christians to this day. Of course, what is going to happen with ISIS, we don't know how the Christian community is going to endure. I believe they're going to survive and perhaps prosper in the future. God can do anything. But I think Christians need to change their attitude towards the Arab people. Maybe not necessarily Islam, because I think there's a challenge that we have to confront with Islam. Islam needs to reform. There's structural problems with Islam that have to be dealt with, such as the conquest model. Because Muhammad and the rightly guided caliphs carried out religious warfare and conquest that's validated the views of many Muslims. And religious inspired violence is not something we should be held as an ideal, but unfortunately many Muslims do, and that needs to change. Let's go back to this verse I mentioned about Judea. Some believe where it says Judea in this verse, it should read Edessa. Edessa was an Aramaic-speaking kingdom. It's where the Syriac dialect originated. It's a kingdom in the borders of the Roman and Parthian empires. Hugh Schofield did this original New Testament translation of the Bible. It's an interesting version. And in this version of the New Testament, he writes in his footnote, his quotation says, both context and sense show that the reading Judea here must be wrong. Why? Because they're talking about foreigners, right? And it puts Judea in the middle of a list of foreign nations. But they were in Judea. The temple was in Judea. The apostles decided to stay in Jerusalem, which is in Judea. So it seems like there must be a scribal or textual error in this verse. And Schofield thinks that it should say Edessa. He says a scribal misreading of Edessa, Haditha in Aramaic, has been assumed, which comes approximately geographically between Mesopotamia and Cappadocia. So he's saying that on the way that the people are describing these different countries, Edessa should be in that spot anywhere because that's where it was in the map. So Hugh Schofield is probably correct that in this verse it mentioned Edessa. And he goes on to say on the evangelization of Edessa, see Eusebius's Ecclesiastical History, chapter 1, verse 13. Eusebius wrote his Ecclesiastical History shortly after Constantine issued the Edict of Toleration for Christians. This book tells the story of the early church from the times of the apostles, continuing the Acts of the Apostles, and going on until Eusebius' own day. So I think he wrote this book around the year 325, and it's really a very important book. And it tells, like I said, he continues the book of where the book of Acts leaves off, and he goes on to his own day. Very inspiring stories about the persecution of the early church under Nero. For instance, the story of the burning of Rome and Christians being crucified and burnt and fed to the lions. That happened after, some of the New Testament had, like the book of Revelation is very late. But these stories, even though we know they happened historically, they're not written in the Bible. So Eusebius is an important source for that, and he's called the father of church history. So it's a very important source, and I found it very inspirational reading. But one of the stories mentioned in Eusebius' church histories, he talks about the story of Thaddeus, which is called in Aramaic Ma'adai. And I'll talk about this story in just a moment. This book is also an important resource for exploring the Jewish roots of the faith, since Eusebius preserved writings and important information about the early Jewish believers in Yeshua the Messiah and Jesus. There's a lot of information about James, the brother of Jesus, that's preserved by Eusebius. Information about the descendants of Jude. There's a church father called Hegesippus, and he's like Papias. He's one of the early first generation of Christians, born during the apostolic period. So he was able to collect a lot of important information about the apostolic period, but Hegesippus is lost. But Eusebius quoted from Hegesippus, who was a Jewish Christian, extensively. So we have a lot of stories about John, about James, about Philip, and a few other apostles like Thaddeus that aren't in the Bible that Eusebius has preserved for us. It's a very important book, and like I said, it's very inspired reading. But Eusebius goes on and tells the story of the first 200 years of the history of the church. So it's a very important book, and we find the story of the birth of the Assyrian Church of the East, or the Syriac churches, in Eusebius' works. Eusebius went to the city of Edessa, which is now called Urfa, and it's in Turkey now, but it's ancient Mesopotamia, really. It's very close to the border of Syria. Eusebius tells the story of the Apostle Thaddeus that he claims he found in the city archives in the city-state of Edessa. So he went to Edessa, he went through the city archives, and he found official records in the Aramaic language that talked about the Apostle Thaddeus, one of the disciples of Jesus, coming to Edessa and healing the king of a disease and converting him to faith in Jesus as Messiah. So Eusebius went to Edessa, went through the archives, he saw this Aramaic writing. Eusebius knew Aramaic, so he translated it into Greek and included it in his ecclesiastical history. So, some people say, well, is this really true? We don't have those records anymore, but we know that the records were there. Eusebius saw them, and he believed them to be authentic. According to the Eastern tradition, Thaddeus, Thomas, and one of the 70 disciples of Jesus, a man named Mari, brought the gospel to Edessa and Mesopotamia. And I have these books here. There's like a trilogy of books about the birth of Eastern Christianity. And the first one is the teaching of Addai, the doctrine of Addai, which is the story of Thaddeus converting King Abgar and evangelizing the Assyrian people and the people of Edessa. And this version says the teaching of Addai. Usually I refer to this book as the doctrine of Addai, or it's the Acts of Thaddeus. The story is continued in the Acts of Mari, the apostle. And we see in this version of the book is we have the Syriac or the Aramaic on this side and the English translation on this one, and we also see that in this book as well. So you can get these books and read them. I'd recommend reading Eusebius and these two books. I think the Doctrine of Addai is a very good book, and it's very inspirational reading. The third book of the trilogy is the Acts of Thomas. Now, we know from the writings of a pilgrim named Etheria that Thomas also went to Edessa, but the Acts of Thomas tells the story of Thomas going past Edessa, past Parthia, and into India. So the book called the Acts of Thomas talks about the evangelization of India. And I've been to India, I've retraced the steps of Thomas in India, and you can watch one of the videos I have of me going on that pilgrimage. So Thaddeus, Mari, and Thomas, Doubting Thomas, as he's known in the West, are the three founders of Syriac Christianity. And Thomas, of course, is the founder of the Church in India. And he's highly honored in India. So, okay, the story goes, let's look at Matthew chapter 4:24. It says, news about Jesus, about him, spread all over Syria. I think that's significant. That at the very beginning of Matthew's gospel, he mentions that the fame of Jesus was all across Syria. So, according to the Bible, so if Hugh Schofield's reading is correct, then we have the city of Edessa mentioned in the book of Acts. And here at the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, the gospel is said to have gone, the message of Jesus, the fame of Jesus, has gone across all of Syria, not just in Judea, but across all of Syria. So the story is that there's a messenger named Hanan who served King Abgar of Edessa. And according to the story, the story is recorded in the Doctrine of Addai. Hanan, or Ananias, is what he's called in Greek. He delivered the message to Jesus at the household of Gamaliel, the ruler of the Jews. The Gamaliel is mentioned in the book of Acts. Gamaliel is the member of the Sanhedrin who calls for toleration of Christians. He asked that Jesus would come and heal King Abgar of the disease in which he is suffering. So Jesus says, well, the hour of my glorification has come, I cannot go, but later I'll send one of my disciples. So at the day of Pentecost, Thomas, moved by the Holy Spirit, instructed Thaddeus to go to the east and spread the gospel. So Thaddeus went to the Jewish community there, to the household of a Jew named Tobias, and then began winning people to the gospel. King Abgar heard about Thaddeus and asked for him to come to him. Thaddeus prayed for the king, and the king was healed and converted. Then Thaddeus and Mari continued to spread the gospel across the area. Later, Thomas himself stopped and preached in India. He preached in Edessa on his way to India. So Thomas, Thaddeus, and Mari are the three founders of the Aramaic-speaking church. If you go to, like when I was in India, I went to southern India, the state of Kerala, where Thomas did a lot of his work. I went to a church service there, and the service was in Aramaic, the language of Jesus. And it just so happened, but most of the time they do the services in Malayalam, the local language there. But all the Catholic and Orthodox churches in India often use Aramaic. That's because they belong to the Syriac church tradition. An ancient liturgy, which we'll discuss later, called the Anaphora of Mar Mari and Mar Addai, is the oldest continually used Christian liturgy in the world, and it's, according to tradition, it was written by Thaddeus and Mari. So I think that's very important. So that's the conclusion of this episode, and I hope that you can join us for the next program as we continue this series in the Aramaic School of the Bible.
Research, rescue, and restore. Help Voice of the Word and Aramaic Christian Ministries mission research the ancient languages, peoples, lands, cultures, and times of the Bible. Rescue persecuted Assyrian Christians in the Middle East and restore Christianity to its original Semitic roots. For Stephen Missick's books, online giving, and other resources from Aramaic Christian Ministries, visit www.stephenmissick.com. Join us next time on Voice of the Word as we research the Scriptures, rescue persecuted Christians, and restore the Church to its Semitic roots.